Warm welcome to all of you in your glass cages. It's a great pleasure to be here. I want to thank the organizers for the invitation. I used to travel to conferences and to different countries non-stop, and hasn't happened in the past 6 months. This is my first travel and my first conference since the middle of March. So I'm particularly thankful and appreciative of that and the invitation. It's a great pleasure to see that things are finally coming back to normal. This is my first book. I published a couple since then, but I think for what I'm going to talk about today and some of the issues that I'm interested in, it's a book that deals with them, with the way our world is changing, not just in response to China, but in response to further integration across Eurasia, a world of a new kind of geopolitics where technology is the most important factor, and I think this is where we get into rather interesting areas for this conference in particular, where new cities are being born across these trade and economic routes. Let me show you the map. It's a good place to start. This is what one could call a map of the Belt and Road. It's very difficult to draw a map of the Belt and Road because it is such a vague and abstract concept. But what it does mean for sure is further integration between Europe and Asia, further integration between Europe and China, across trade routes that were not particularly developed over the past few decades. It is a new kind of globalization that brings many of the countries that were left out right into the center. It has two parts, one integration across maritime routes and the other integration across land routes. You can see that in the land segment of the Belt and Road, we had a number of economic corridors, 6 economic corridors, broadly speaking, coming through West Asia, through Central Asia, linking China and Europe, and then Pakistan Economic Corridor, going all the way from China to Gwadar, and also Southeast Asia. There are a few things to say about this map, of course. First of all, where is the United States? Has disappeared. One imagines it's in the reverse of the map, but it's been moved from the obverse to the reverse of the map. And I think that's a nice metaphor and a nice introduction to the Belt and Road, because the Belt and Road is fundamentally a project to overturn the American economic and political order. And so the United States has disappeared. Europe is obviously the end point and the destination of the Belt and Road. And many of these trade routes end up in Europe, in particular the maritime Silk Road from China to Europe through the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean. Let me also call your attention to the development of new cities, or at least cities that used to be not very significant and now have become significant. I visited all of the main ones. Let me call your attention to them. Sihanoukville in Cambodia. That's a particularly interesting place. Used to be a very peaceful tourist destination for European backpackers. It has now been turned into a boisterous metropolis of gambling, of illegal gambling, of crime, but also of trade. But one expects great things to come out of Sihanoukville once it goes through this process of transformation. Gwadar used to be a very quiet fishing village in Pakistan, has now been turned into what could become one of the main ports in the world, and clearly its location here in Pakistan in the Indian Ocean, but very close to the Persian Gulf, is a strategic location. And the third example I would give is Hargis, exactly on the border between China and Kazakhstan. And in some respects, that is the border between China and Europe, because even though we're not used to thinking about Kazakhstan as a European country, it is a European country, according to the well-established definition that part of its territory is in Europe. That part there in Atirau is geographically part of Europe, so formally Kazakhstan could apply to be a member of the European Union, as strange as it may sound at first. And so the border between China and Kazakhstan is the border between China and Europe. There is a border between China and Europe. Think about it in those terms. Now let me show you a few pictures of Hargis. I think it's the best introduction one could have to the Belt and Road. This is the dry port in Hargis. It's planned to become one of the main ports in the world, perhaps in the future responsible for 4% of the Asia-Europe trade by land. So this is a dry port, as far away from the ocean as one can imagine. Look at the map, almost at the point of maximum distance from the oceans in Eurasia. But it is a gigantic port. A lot of investment has gone into it. Infrastructure is top-notch. These giant cranes can transfer cargo from one train to another in less than 1 hour. They can empty a full train and transfer the cargo to another train. And the idea is to transform Hargis into a point of connection where trains from China can stop, the cargo can be transferred into new trains, and they depart from Hargis to different destinations already with their predetermined cargo. Now, around the port, there's an industrial zone being developed, and I think this is an important lesson about the Belt and Road. All these new cities that I've talked about are cities where the conception is certainly to combine trade and retail and daily life in a much tighter way than we think about it in our, according to our Western models. All these cities are developing industrial zones, massive ports, and new recreational areas at the same time. So one has to think about cities as combining ports and the city in a much more intimate way than you used to think about. And that creates a sort of a city landscape that is very different from what we're used to. But I think it will remain as a permanent mark of some of the new cities that the new China and the Belt and Road are developing. Let me show you a few more images. Another interesting concept in Hargis. Now, these two towers and this gate is the border between Kazakhstan and China. And you can still see an old tower for surveillance up there, but has been deactivated. And why has it been deactivated? Because this now isn't really the actual border. China and Kazakhstan have created what they call an international trade zone, and that's essentially a perimeter, half in China, half in Kazakhstan, within which you can circulate freely. So you can cross the physical border between the two countries freely without showing any ID. You have to show an ID when you enter the international trade zone. But it's a rather massive area. You circulate freely inside. You cross from China to Kazakhstan. And then you go to different retail pavilions where you can buy on the Chinese side that you see there, Chinese merchandise, and then when you cross into the Kazakh side, you can buy Kazakh merchandise. But it's a sort of amusement park in some ways because you are exposed to an ethnographic experience of traveling among Chinese sellers and buying Chinese products and then crossing the border into Kazakhstan. Now, Kazakhs, when they come into this area, they can circulate freely and they can cross into China. They can even sleep in a hotel on the Chinese side. But then when they leave the trade area, they have to leave through the Kazakh side. And you don't have to have any visa. You can be in China without any visa because you only need a visa once you would leave through the Chinese side into China. So it's an interesting concept, as if you created a Schengen zone, but only on the border areas of the two countries. And it could be expanded. It could become an even larger zone. One could live inside these areas for months or perhaps even years. It's an interesting concept to explore. China is also developing it on the border with Mongolia. And it's certainly one of the concepts that is coming out of the Belt and Road are these cross-border trade areas. And of course, the retail experience is also very interesting to look at and to see how it differs from the way we think about retail. This is Hargis. This is the newest Chinese city. If you see the Google Maps from 5 years ago, there's nothing, complete empty steppe. And now it's a city of 200,000 people that is supposed to grow very quickly into 1 million. I haven't been back, of course, since COVID. Look at the city. It's not how one thinks about a Chinese city. It's not even how the eastern Chinese cities look like. Of course, Xi'an, for example, or Wuhan, they have been thoroughly renovated. They no longer look like the old Xi'an or the old Wuhan. But they also don't look like this. This is a new kind of city, which in some respects reminds one of a Californian city. This could be perhaps Palo Alto. It's interesting to see some resemblance. In some respects, China does still try to mimic the look of Western cities in some respects. That's already disappearing in some areas. Chinese cities are extraordinarily green, carefully landscaped. Some of the cities like Wuhan, parts of it look like a natural park, very different from a traditional Chinese city, but that's the way it's going. Remember, the Belt and Road is not just about infrastructure. It's also about the creation of wholly new cities and even wholly new images of what a city should be like. And final image, this is a guest house, a rather cheap hotel. And certainly there are, when I visited a couple of years ago, Hargis was still at the beginning of its development, and you couldn't find much better hotels than this. But there was already a 4-star hotel being built, and I'm sure by now probably there's already a 5-star hotel as well. But this is a modest guest house. What I find interesting is that you find here signage not only in 3 languages, but in 3 scripts. You have there Cyrillic, because this is, of course, the border with Kazakhstan, even though Kazakhstan, you may know, has now adopted the Roman script, but in a very phased-out transition, so Cyrillic is still common in Kazakhstan. Then you have, of course, Chinese there on top, and then you have Arabic script, which is used for the Uyghur language, which is, of course, Hargis is in Xinjiang, with a majority Uyghur population. Interesting that these Chinese cities are becoming, this is something we may not realize at first, they are becoming multicultural cities. China is having to deal with the problem of bringing different cultures together. In some cases successfully, in other cases not successfully at all. And one could talk about the problems in Xinjiang, of course. But it's something that China is being forced to do, and one can imagine that these cities will rise as really multicultural places. There was a restaurant in Hargis where you could actually see 4 different scripts on the facade, because it was a Georgian restaurant, so you had also the Georgian script. In Sihanoukville, one sees the same, a clash between traditional Khmer culture and Chinese culture. The signage on the shops is now almost entirely Chinese, and Cambodians have to adapt to that. You know, my experience in Sihanoukville, you can see Sihanoukville there in Cambodia. My experience in Sihanoukville, from the very first moment when I arrived at the airport, the driver that took me to the center was complaining that he spent 5 years of his life learning English because, you know, growing up, he could see that all the tourists were Europeans, many Germans arriving for the nice beaches and cheap food. And after he spent 5 years learning English, he suddenly realized that there were going to be no more Europeans and everyone there is Chinese. And you have to spend but I told him it's not going to be 5 years to learn Mandarin. It's going to be more than 5, and I think he agreed with me. So this clash of cultures is happening everywhere across the Belt and Road. What is the Belt and Road? Let me turn to that after this short introduction. I feel very strongly about the idea that the Belt and Road is not about infrastructure. Even in this map, where you do have gas pipelines, rail connections, you also have these economic corridors that are clearly not about infrastructure, and one doesn't even know very well what those arrows mean. See this arrow here from the border between China and Kyrgyzstan, going all the way to Gwadar. It's just an arrow projecting economic influence, economic power, but it's not a railway or a road. And these arrows going from China to Europe, but it's the same, or the maritime Silk Road. So what we're really talking about here is economic influence, economic power, and China's economic expansion, much more than infrastructure. In the original speech in 2013, when Xi Jinping first introduced the Belt and Road, infrastructure is only one of the 5 pillars. And it's very clear from his speech, it's a short speech you can read online, very clear that infrastructure is not even the main pillar. What he's mostly concerned about is economic integration, trade integration, financial integration, and then contacts between people, cultural integration. Infrastructure is necessary, has to be present, but it's not the final purpose of the initiative. One obvious example is e-commerce, which I think will be very interesting for this audience. Obviously, you need new infrastructure, and this infrastructure that is here has already fundamentally altered the landscape for e-commerce. It used to be the case that for Chinese companies to deliver in Russia, they needed 50 days, and now they only need 5 because of the new infrastructure, not only physical, but also, of course, legal, new regulations that have been put in place for customs and other frameworks. This new infrastructure has reduced the delivery time to 5 days, making it possible, for example, for Alibaba to become a dominant presence in Russia. And it's happening in other countries as well. But infrastructure is, let us say, the first step towards these processes of economic, political, and cultural integration. In the speech, that is very obvious. Let me remind you as well that the Belt and Road is supposed to be a long-term project. When I first started to hear about it, the Belt and Road was presented as a plan to be concluded in 2049. And this was in 2013, 2014. It was very common to hear this. Last year, when I was living in China, I started to hear about how the Belt and Road was a 100-year project. A 100-year project is obviously not an infrastructure project. Even the Marshall Plan was concluded in just a few years. A 100-year project is a project to fundamentally change, transform the world's economic and political order. And that's what the Belt and Road is about. What is the Belt and Road for? Let me spend the last 10 minutes on this. And let me start by saying that this question is often raised in China. One might think that the Belt and Road is just accepted from the top, the way it is and has been presented. But there's actually a rather vibrant debate going on, not always on the pages of newspapers or in official lectures, but when one has dinner with Chinese intellectuals or Chinese officials or Chinese academics, the issue is discussed. And many times you hear criticisms of the Belt and Road in China. I remember a lecture I gave in Wuhan, actually shortly before the troubles started there. And at the end, one young man that was finishing his PhD got up and asked, why do we need the Belt and Road? Why are we investing so much money abroad? We can use that money here. Why are we creating so many jobs abroad? We need those jobs here. Sort of a vaguely populist argument that you would also hear in Europe. And on that occasion, as on many other occasions, I was the one who had to defend the logic of the Belt and Road against my Chinese interlocutor. What is the logic of the Belt and Road? It's fundamentally a project of economic expansion, of economic globalization. China and Chinese officials believe that China needs to expand its economic power worldwide if it's going to continue on a trajectory of economic growth. And the 3 arguments you hear most often are the following. First, if China wants to become a technologically advanced country, it needs to move resources, capital and labor into high-tech areas. But if you move resources and capital into high-tech areas, you need to integrate with other countries that can occupy the position on lower-tech segments of the value chain. Capital and labor are scarce. They have to be concentrated in certain areas. So who is going to produce the food that China needs? If China continues to move people out of agriculture into industrial areas and high-tech areas. And very obviously, what China has in mind, particularly with this corridor linking Pakistan and China, is for Pakistan to become a fundamentally agricultural country that can provide 1.5 billion Chinese with the agricultural goods that they will need in the future. So you need value chains. You need economic specialization. The Belt and Road is a framework that can put that in place. When Chinese banks decide what projects to support in Pakistan, they will support the projects that fit with China's economic plans. If China needs increasing food production in Pakistan, Chinese banks will support those projects. It doesn't have to be a coercive framework necessarily. If you control the chains of financial globalization and financial integration, it's possible to determine economic outcomes in other countries. In that respect, not so different from Western-led globalization and financial integration. So that's certainly one area where a lot is happening. You also need access to markets. And we've seen this with the Chinese company Huawei. Huawei would need access to global markets. It is struggling to preserve that access, but obviously the Belt and Road is a plan to make sure that the network of political and economic influence is in place so that countries will think twice before excluding a Chinese company, even if they are under pressure from US authorities, for example, as is the case with Huawei. The technology that we're talking about, in particular new internet technology, new platforms, but also 5G, robotics, artificial intelligence, necessitates such levels of investment that you can only guarantee the return on investment if you have access to truly global markets. This ensures that that access is there. And finally, and I think particularly important, if you want China to become a technologically advanced country, you need Chinese companies to increasingly control global technological standards. So a standard as simple as a USB port in a computer, in a laptop, has been developed by particular companies. Part of that technology is copyrighted, and those that develop that technology will receive a licensing fee or a royalty every time someone builds a laptop. And this, the more you study it, the more you realize, is really at the core of global economic power. Because you may well have a company that is building great laptops, but all the components in the laptop have been copyrighted by other companies. And in the end, your profit margins are squeezed to the bare minimum because you're paying so much in royalties and licensing fees to the people that hold the copyright. And this is something that China has complained for 20 years. It's building good technology, but it doesn't control the global technological standards. Now, if you have a framework like the Belt and Road, it is possible to exert the levels of political and economic influence that will guarantee that when the international bodies where these global standards are defined meet, that many of the companies that sit in those borders and many of the government agencies that sit in those bodies will vote for Chinese key technologies. And that's happened already a lot with 5G. Huawei holds copyright to many of the components of 5G technology. If you read in the Wall Street Journal a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, there was a very good report of a meeting that happened in Lake Tahoe in the United States to determine a number of key technological standards for 5G. And Huawei actually won that vote precisely because it had so many global companies on its side, some American companies, and so many countries in Africa, in Asia, voting for the Chinese candidate. Because the way this works is that in those international bodies, there are different key technologies that are put to a vote to determine what is going to be the key technological standard. Now, we may be entering a world where technological areas are so fragmented that in one area, one technological standard will be applied and accepted, and in another area, there will be other technological standards. It would be very unfortunate if this were the outcome, because essentially one would not be able to use the same technology worldwide. But it may well happen if one continues to see the same pressure being put from the American side to exclude Chinese technology at the same time that China continues to develop technologically. That's one outcome, but China is still banking on the idea that there will be global technological standards. It just wants those technological standards to be Chinese. Final point that I want to talk about, and then I think in the question period we can turn to more specific questions about this may impact retail more specifically. Final question, how does COVID change this equation? Now, I feel quite strongly that after the initial period of turmoil, the pandemic will probably be more of an opportunity than a threat for China's plans. And I think we see that already. The way China has come out of the pandemic in good shape, and one does not have to trust the Chinese authorities on this. You know, all my friends in China report that they go to rock concerts and to nightclubs normally at this point, which is something that is difficult to imagine for the time being here or in the United States. The way China has come out so quickly out of the pandemic, the way its industry has actually continued to work normally throughout the whole pandemic, the way market share of Chinese companies has been growing, the way investment in the Belt and Road has been growing. It was 27% higher in 2020 compared to 2019, pandemic and all, offers an opportunity for China. And I see particularly a number of avenues where China's economic influence might take advantage of the pandemic. If one looks at India, there's obviously a very intense economic competition happening between India and China, particularly on the internet economy, development of new apps, where India has become quite competitive, and it's a huge market. India just contracted 23% in the second quarter of 2020, Indian GDP. Chinese numbers that one cannot trust entirely. China has grown 3.2% in the second quarter. Even if one doesn't trust those numbers entirely, it's obviously that the gap between India and China is growing. And India will find it difficult to overcome the challenges posed by the pandemic. There are other countries that seem more in need of Chinese economic power now than they needed before the pandemic as a way to deal with the crisis. This is true of Pakistan, certainly it's true of Indonesia. It may well be true of Russia. What we've seen over the past 6 months is that the reluctance that Russia had to accept Chinese economic presence has been eroding, because once you're in the middle of a crisis, you have no alternative. Suddenly your mind starts to change, and Russia had been quite resistant, for good reasons, to Chinese economic expansion, but that resistance is eroding. Second factor that I think can happen is, of course, there's a certain impact, in particular, on American prestige worldwide, that countries look to the United States and see the difficulty in overcoming the pandemic, successive waves of infection. And for many countries, particularly in Africa, particularly in Southeast Asia, this may change the perceptions they have about China and the United States. Countries that are in between the two models, the two political economic models, may look to China and think that, well, this model guarantees state efficiency in a way that the American model cannot guarantee. This will not work in Europe for the time being, but in many parts of the world it will be a powerful argument. And finally, I think what may well happen as well is the crisis will depress asset prices worldwide, opening up opportunities for Chinese companies to scoop up some of these assets at depressed prices. And I think we'll see this happening in Europe in particular. Give it a few more months or a year or two, and it's easy to imagine that Chinese companies will be in a good position to acquire assets, particularly in Southern Europe, in Italy and other countries at depressed prices. There is a lot of political resistance to Chinese economic power, but in many countries as well, that political resistance might not survive the harshness of an economic crisis that we've just only entered, in my opinion. So to conclude, what we see with the Belt and Road is not a purely infrastructure project. It is a project of political and economic power. It's a project that is seen by Chinese authorities as being the next stage in Chinese economic expansion, and in particular is a project that is meant to facilitate and promote China's technological development through the creation of new global value chains, through the creation of new technological standards, and through the opening up of global markets for new global Chinese companies, The idea is that China can advance towards a more technological society and a more technological economy while projecting its power worldwide. Now, I very much look forward to trying to apply some of these lessons to your experience, both now in the question period, but also afterwards as we talk outside and until lunchtime.